Okay, well, good evening, everybody. This evening, the content of the presentation is proprietary and confidential information of the Florida Firefighter Safety and Health Collaborative. It is not intended to be distributed by any party without the written consent of the collaborative. Attend note that the educational component of this session is being recorded and will be published on the Florida Firefighter Safety and Health Collaborative's YouTube page. To maintain complete confidentiality, an announcement will be made before the recording begins, and only the presenter will be identified during the recording. Therefore, to ensure your complete privacy, all attendees are asked to mute their microphones until an announcement is made that the recording is complete. Presentations are intended for educational purposes only and do not replace independent professional judgment. The ideas expressed in this presentation are the professional opinion of the presenter and do not necessarily represent those of the Florida Firefighter Safety and Health Collaborative or its constituents. Before acting on any of the information presented, attendees should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to their individual situation and seek independent professional advice should any concerns arise. If you or anyone you know are in what is believed or perceived to be a situation that is or may become harmful, please reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline via phone at 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-8255, or through their website, suicidepreventionhotline.org, or as always, in the event of an emergency, please dial 911. With that, we are very grateful to welcome Jo Terry this evening to share with us everything from her firsthand experience of loss by suicide and everything that she's learned in the process from just that firsthand experience. So, Jo, thank you for making time to be with us this evening, and just for the humbleness and the change that you're bringing to everybody's life and sharing your story. With that, I'm going to hand it to you and take it away, Jo.
Thank you, Michelle. As she said, my name is Jo Terry, and I want to start by saying that I am coming from the perspective of a widow. I am not a clinician. I am a physical therapist by trade, 30 plus years, owning my own private practice with my husband, Chip, as my partner. And everything that I'm about to present is from my perspective, just like Michelle said. In those sleepless nights after Chip committed suicide, I had a lot of time to learn and relearn the anatomy of the brain and connect the dots between the brain and PTSD. And I'm here to share that with you all right now. So I will start. This is my husband, Chip. He was a career firefighter with the city of Covington, which is in Kentucky, right on the Ohio River, across the border from Cincinnati, Ohio. So like I said, in those sleepless nights, I had a lot of time on my hands, and I was immensely curious about what PTSD was and had to relearn some of the anatomy of the brain. So this may be very basic to a lot of you, but for me, it was something I really didn't understand. Even though in PT school we did a lot of neuroanatomy, it was stuff that I had learned years ago. So when I looked it up and I started studying, there are three parts of the brain that are very intimately involved in PTSD. At the bottom, you see the gray brain stem, which is just the part of our brain that is the most primitive. And that part of the brain is responsible for just basic things like breathing and swallowing. If you move into the more central part of the brain where that colorful piece is, that's the middle brain, and it houses our limbic system. And the limbic system is responsible for our autonomic nervous system, which is our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And we'll talk about that in a second. But more importantly, what I found were these two little pieces, the red called the amygdala, which is responsible for our fear response. Basically, it regulates our fight or flight mode. and the hippocampus, which sits right behind it, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for consolidating emotions with memories, as well as, believe it or not, our spatial navigation. So for first responders, for those that are dealing with severe PTSD, finding themselves directionally challenged may be something new for them. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But those two, the amygdala and the hippocampus, along with the prefrontal cortex, are the three parts of our brain that are most affected by PTSD. The prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that really makes us who we are, in particular, your own personality. And it's the part of your brain that's responsible for higher level thought processes. So remember those names. We're going to talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the sympathetic nervous system is really what places us in reactive mode. So when we go into the brain is under a threat, or the person is under a threat, we turn on the sympathetic nervous system. And when that happens, our body releases stress hormones. And those hormones are cortisol, norepinephrine, and adrenaline. We used to call the big C in the firefighting world cancer, but now we have to start looking at another big C, and that's cortisol, and the way cortisol affects our body. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when the sympathetic nervous system is turned on, everything else in our body is shut down. So you don't feel sexual arousal, you don't feel hunger or thirst, you can't sleep. Your body shuts down anything that is not essential. In addition to that, our heart rate and our respirations accelerate, and our body converts our glycogen to glucose for energy. And as a result, the individual is ready to either fight or flee. On the other side, we have the parasympathetic nervous system. This is responsible for restorative mode. This is what brings us back down. In our body, it reduces our stress hormones, so they're not gone. Your body just stops production of those hormones, but nevertheless, those hormones are still flowing through your bloodstream, and it takes quite a while for them to clear. When the parasympathetic nervous system is turned on, our respirations and heart rate slowly return to normal. And it's in this place where an individual is able to feed, breathe, and rest. So when we talk about the effects of stress hormones, particularly with our first responders, we're talking about all of these different things that are directly impacted by cortisol. And the research is starting to show weight gain, fatigue, all of these other issues are affected by the abnormally high levels of cortisol in the body. So when we talk about a normal response to trauma, and when we say normal here, I mean a brain that is healthy. When a healthy individual is exposed to a threat, the limbic system takes over and sends us off into reactive mode. So the non-essential functions are shut down, and our body is prepared to fight or flight. This is in every animal within the animal kingdom. We all react the same with increased levels of cortisol, and we're either going to fight or flee. When the threat ceases, our body switches over to the parasympathetic nervous system, and we go into restorative mode. The stress hormones are reduced, and our brain shifts back to normal. When an individual truly has PTSD, the response is the same when the threat is presented. They're either prepared to fight or flee. However, when their threat is gone, they are unable to shift back into restorative mode. So they are held in a constant reactive state. So these individuals are people that we call hypervigilant. They are the individuals who always have to sit and face the door. You hear about that a lot in our vet population, but when I go out and I talk to a lot of first responders, you'll see there are a significant number of those that feel that need to face the door. Now, that doesn't mean every one of them have PTSD, but it means that they're functioning in a higher reactive state than the normal brain would be functioning in. So what is PTSD? Well, PTSD has been around as long as we've had wars. We have different names, but the same exact reaction to the prolonged exposure to trauma. Today, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. There's huge debate about whether it's actually a disorder or an injury. The reason we consider it a disorder is strictly because of a label and a name. So what I try to explain is that an injury or a diagnosis has certain qualifying symptoms that occur with it. And so with post-traumatic stress disorder, we have 4 different categories. And for an individual to be diagnosed with PTSD, they must exhibit symptoms in all 4 of those categories. In addition to that, those symptoms have to linger more than 30 days, and they must cause some type of impairment in their daily life. So with that being said, if we take it to my world of orthopedic physical therapy, I try to explain that it's sort of like acute versus chronic. So the individual with that knee there is someone that has gone down with a soccer injury, and let's say it's an ACL tear. That individual presents with signs and symptoms such as pain, loss of motion, a limp, impairments that may affect them with the way they walk, and they go off to the doctor. The doctor takes a look at them, diagnoses them with an ACL tear, gives it a code, and sends that code off to an insurance company, which is recognized, and then the injury is covered. The other individual with the back injury, let's say that's spinal stenosis. This is more of a chronic injury. This is someone who has accumulated injuries over the course of a lifetime, and we can't identify the date of the injury that caused it because it's a chronic injury. It occurs over time. But nevertheless, that individual has signs and symptoms that a physician is going to recognize. Then they label that with a code, send it off to the insurance company, and that individual has that injury covered. So when we wrap that back around to the brain, when we talk about an acute injury to the brain, we will be discussing something like a concussion, which has obvious signs and symptoms, and we know when it occurs, and it's an acute injury. On the other hand, PTSD is something that is chronic. It occurs over time. It's not just one event typically that causes post-traumatic stress disorder, but it still has signs and symptoms that a qualified clinician or a physician is going to recognize, give it a code, and send it off to an insurance company to be covered. Okay? So here we go. This is the crux of it all. What happens to the brain with PTSD? PTSD causes your brain to function in high alert. So as a result of that, your amygdala, that little piece in the brain that we just looked at on the other screen, which is responsible for fight or flight, physiologically enlarges. So when we wrap that back around to my world in physical therapy, when you load a muscle with a weight over and over again, over time, that muscle enlarges. We call that hypertrophy. When a muscle is not engaged or not used, it atrophies. So when you have large amounts of cortisol coursing through your bloodstream, over time, that changes the physiology that's occurring in your body. And it doesn't just affect the heart other organs in the body, it also affects the brain. So that cortisol is part of the reason why that amygdala physiologically changes. The hippocampus, the part of your brain that's responsible for memory and emotions, physiologically shrinks because we have the amygdala overstimulated. Additionally, the prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain, which is responsible for making you who you are, for helping you make higher level decisions and thought processes, understanding consequences of your action, is also understimulated, and it physiologically changes as well. So as a result, an individual that's living with PTSD has a thinking center that is underactivated, an emotional center that is underactivated, and a fear center that is overactivated. So when I take my husband and I talk about my husband, this is a man who is very bright, very intelligent. But as time went on, he was not using those pieces of his brain. He was not thinking clearly. He was not in a rational place when he chose suicide rather than living. This is a slide from Dr. Amen, who is a leading neurologist in the country. And these are scans of the brain that are available on the internet. And you can clearly see in the first incidence, that's a healthy brain. So these individuals are having their brains scanned in a relaxed state, maybe listening to some music, and they're measuring what part of the brains are activated. So in a healthy individual, you can see the parts in color that are activated. When you move to the individual with classic PTSD, you see that other parts are activated and some parts from the healthy brain are not activated. So we see that the fear center is actually being stimulated when they're in the same relaxed, controlled environment as the individual with the healthy brain scan. And then when you add a classic TBI, you see that that brain is not functioning well either. And again, I am not a clinician. I am not a neurologist. It's just very evident to me by looking at these pictures that there are different parts of the brain activated than the normal healthy individual. So here we are. These are first responder stressors. And these are the stressors that our first responders live with every day they go to work. So the rest of us, for instance, in my world, are never exposed to these stressors. But we have those regular stressors that everybody has. You know, you have spouse issues, you have financial issues, you may have health issues, you have work-related issues. And those issues all create a certain amount of stress that we are able to deal with as they come. But these first responders are dealing with that as well as all of this. So their stress bucket is completely full. These are the symptoms of PTSD. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But when I teach to my first responders and I ask about sleep disturbance, there are very few who say they sleep normally. These symptoms are widely available. A lot of fire departments post them in places like the kitchen or the restroom. But unfortunately, you can read this list and really not see it in your own life. And that's what we're going to talk about in a minute. Before I get into that, after Chip completed suicide, and it's 4 years this month that he's been gone, I had my own sleepless nights. So my daughter, Michaela, found this paper. It was a white paper commissioned by the Rudderman family up in Boston. And they found after 9/11 that we were losing a very high number of our first responders in their region to suicide. So they commissioned this paper to be written, and these are their results. Firefighters and police officers are at a significantly higher level of risk for PTSD, depression, and suicidal thoughts. I found it interesting that the police with suicidal thoughts was listed at 7.8%, but it makes sense when you think about their career and the fact that they a lot of times carry a sidearm, and admitting to being suicidal could jeopardize their career. So it's estimated that that number is really underreported here in this paper. These are the stats from Jeff Dill with the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance. And Jeff tracks line of duty deaths as well as suicides. And he captures these every year. I do not have 2020 in there yet because I actually haven't had time. And the numbers have to be vetted when it comes to the suicides. So those are all reported suicides that Jeff vets to ensure that they're actually related to PTSD and firefighters. I had to report Chip's in 2017 because he was retired. And if I hadn't reported it, I don't think anyone would have connected it. So as you can see, we're losing almost double the number of firefighters to suicide than we are line of duty deaths. And I think the thing that you will find if you talk to any mental health clinician is that they will tell you suicide is completely preventable. Our police statistics, far worse. Line of duty deaths are a lot higher compared to our fire department, our line of duty deaths. But look at the suicides and the way the trend is. I'm slightly fearful of seeing what their number was for 2020. So this is Chip. And if you look at the date is 2012. This is his retirement. And in the city of Covington at that time, we were going through a small crisis. They were talking about browning out apparatus. They were talking about layoffs. They were talking about browning out a full department. The city had underfunded our pension plan at the time. And after the stock market crash, they found themselves in quite a bit of trouble. And they were trying to make up some of their losses with our fire and police community. And Chip was leaving right at a time where he felt very guilty about it. And I will preface this by saying my husband was a very private man. He rarely shared emotion, but this got the better of him. And I want you to just kind of listen to what he has to say here.
You know, and there's a lot of talk about our benefits and our pay and all those kind of things. But what people don't see at 3 o'clock in the morning is when a young lieutenant has to put 2 toddlers and their grandmother in a body bag. I've been personally involved in 12 fire fatalities. Not to mention all the thousands and thousands and thousands of runs I've made over 27 years. You know, a 16-year-old boy hangs himself with an electrical cord. How do you close your eyes at night after you do that? You make that run. You know, I've seen people shoot themselves in the head. I've seen children beaten and burned. We are the tip of the spear. We are the people that are out there every day. And I'm so proud of what we accomplished. So, you know, we do have good pay. We do have good benefits. But when we go out into a roach-infested apartment and we're dealing with someone that has some kind of communicable disease, we have to be protected. Not us. We have workers' comp. We have great health. You know, we have all the services that we need. Well, what happens when we go home? You know, we take those things home to our children and our wives. You know, that is the reason we fight so hard for our benefits and our pay and our pension. You know, today, I can lay down in bed and close my eyes and still see the faces of those toddlers. Or the 4-year-old boy I put in a body bag after he drowned in a pool. I can see that. I carry that with me for the rest of my life. And that's not just me. When I say I speak of firefighters, the collective firefighter body of the Covenant Fire Department for the past 150 years. So I'm not standing up here. I don't want anybody's pity. The men and women of the fire department don't want anyone's pity. We just want you to understand what we do when you lay your heads on the pillow at night, when your smoke detector goes off, when your little baby's choking, when your husband has a heart attack. We provide the highest level of service anywhere in the country. Our delivery system is the best because we care. You know.
So that was Chip. And these are the 4 categories of PTSD: intrusive thoughts, mood alterations, hypervigilance, and avoidance. Remember earlier I said an individual has to have symptoms in all 4 categories, and those symptoms need to last longer than 30 days. So Chip's retirement was in 2012. And those runs that he was talking about with the pool drowning and the grandmother and the toddlers, those were all incidents from early in his career. So we clearly fulfilled the intrusive thought category. And I will tell you this, when Chip was starting to really exhibit the symptoms somewhere in 2015, I began to see a change in his behavior. He was definitely becoming more negative about everything in the world, from politics to church to local community stuff, as well as losing interest in the normal things that he liked to do. He was avid about working out, and I just started to see him kind of pull away from the normal routine that he used to have. And he definitely became argumentative. Neurotic behavior, I will tell you, it wasn't just hypervigilance, like sitting facing the door. In 2016 in Normandy, France, there was a Catholic priest who was murdered on the altar. And it was ISIS that killed this priest, along with several other members of the parish. And that really stuck in Chip's brain. And we were this good little Catholic family, and we attended an inner city Catholic church. And one Sunday, shortly after that event in Paris or Normandy, we were in church, all lined up in our pew together. And a gentleman walked in the side door right next to where we always sat. And he was very dirty, disheveled, carrying, a backpack. And the gentleman went to the back of church. Well, Chip jumped out of the pew and stood behind him for the remainder of the Mass. By the end of the service, when we left and got in the car, I said, "What were you doing?" And it was like a switch. All of a sudden, he became argumentative with me. And his comment was, "That could have been ISIS. I was protecting you and our kids and the rest of the people in church." So what in reality was a homeless person in an inner city church looking for a handout, Chip perceived as a threat when there really wasn't one. I will say that it was the most bizarre, aggravated moment I ever remember having with him. Self-destructive behavior, I'm not ashamed to tell people Chip drank. We were a Catholic family, and if you know anything about the Northern Kentucky, Greater Cincinnati area, it's a highly Catholic community, and we drink for everything. A baby's born and we celebrate with baptism, and our weddings and our funerals are all connected with alcohol. And then the two of us met when we were in college, and we met in a bar, and then we enter the fire service, and there was an enormous amount of drinking that went on in the fire department social life. Shift parties, we had alcohol. Funerals, we had alcohol. Weddings, we had alcohol. I just saw the alcohol as part of our everyday life, when in reality, Chip was using the alcohol probably to help him sleep and to help him forget some of those unwanted memories that were crawling around in his brain. But I think when I teach this, the most obvious change that occurred with Chip would probably be the withdrawal. He not only pulled away from me, but he pulled away from the community, our extended family, and our children. And I'm not just talking about a guy who wants his alone time. I'm talking about a guy who is no longer coming to the bedroom. Our intimacy is no longer what it was when we were younger. And so now you have this dynamic in a relationship where I'm starting to get angry because I'm thinking I'm not pretty enough, or I'm not sexy enough, or maybe after having had 4 kids, I'm just not somebody he cares to be with. And so now I'm getting angry in our relationship. So there's this piece of me that will forever think I created this toxic environment for him because I wasn't as compassionate and loving as I should have been, or as I could have been. Had he been diagnosed with an occupational cancer, I would have been the most compassionate, loving caregiver I could imagine. But because this was an unseen, unknown disorder, I know that my anger was also part of our problem within our marriage at that time. But it wasn't just us, it was my kids as well.
12, I had just graduated from Moorhead, and I had come home and I said, Dad, let's go grab a beer. Just the 2 of us, let's go have dinner and a beer. And we were having a great night, just the 2 of us. Finished dinner, and I don't know what I said or what the conversation was, I can't remember it, but he got so angry, and he just kept going on this spiel of how I didn't understand, I was too young, and that my idea wasn't right. And we didn't speak to one another. And I walked into the house, and he went up to the office, and I went into Mom's bedroom, and I said, I'll never go out with him again. He's an ass. And that was not the dad that I grew up with. And I never went out with him again. Just the 2 of us. And that's probably one of my biggest regrets, is not spending time with him, because I was so angry about that situation.
The withdrawal from other people was sort of a big thing. My dream school was to go to American University in DC. My mom and I planned the school visit. The 3 of us were supposed to go together. And like the day before, he canceled. He said he couldn't get away because of work. And I remember I was like devastated. I was pissed at him the whole weekend because it was like 3 days. Like he just had to, and 2 of those days were like a Saturday and a Sunday. He shouldn't have been working anyway. I was so excited, and he couldn't even make it. And I remember for months, like for years really, I would think about it, and it would still upset me a lot.
He never slept. You would come downstairs and the light was on in the office, and you could tell he couldn't sleep unless he was so exhausted. He would work out for hours on end and do these long 10-mile runs, so he was so exhausted he could sleep. But I remember finding a empty bottle of bourbon or whiskey or something, I was too young to even know what it was, hidden on the side of his desk, and I didn't think anything of it. But looking back now, I told my older brother that, and I was like, that's just, like, why was he hiding it?
The stories he would tell me, some that he never told anybody else, and saying that he can't unsee those kinds of things. And I just figured that was part of the job and didn't really know anything about PTSD at the time.
I don't think I ever had an idea there was like such a deep-seated pain.
At the gorge, we would sit by the fire, and you could just tell that he's thinking and seeing things that the fires remind him of.
He didn't hold Henry when Henry was born. He maybe held him 5 times. Didn't hold him in the hospital at all. So that wasn't him. That man that I called an ass and that didn't hold his grandbaby. That was not my dad. 2012. I had just graduated.
So there you have it again. That withdrawal doesn't affect just the individual. It's invasive, and it's in your relationships with everyone, your children, your friends, your spouse. And again, I think of all of the things, if I had to pick one thing that I would recognize now, it would be the withdrawal. I tell everybody I'm smart enough to have never married a jackass. And when you go out and you meet these firefighters that are dealing with the severe PTSD, and I sit and I teach this to them, there are several of them that raise their hand and say, hey, I am that jackass. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you find yourself withdrawing and pulling away, then maybe there's something more to it than just the need to have some alone time. So basically, we know now that cortisol is playing a role in PTSD, and we need to find a way for our first responders to reduce that. And exercise is the number one way of reducing cortisol in your body, in your bloodstream. And in Chip's younger years, he was fanatical about it. And we made time in our lives for both of us to exercise. But toward the end, as he aged and his body wasn't able to do the same things he could do when he was younger, I think that accelerated some of the stuff that we were seeing around 2015, 2016. So this is Chip. He was a well-studied man. He loved to learn and found himself always reading a book. After he graduated with his first degree, he went on to get a master's in organizational leadership, and spent 26 years on the fire department and became an adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati's Fire Science program. Struggled to figure out what he wanted to do after he retired, and that was just one of several jobs that he held. And landed there and at a company called 1-800 Board Up, which is a company that helps with victim assistance. Like if you have a fire or flood or wind damage, they literally will board up or take care of your property for you. And I think he loved that because it put him back into a group of firefighters that he felt connected to again. This is our family. Our 4 older kids are our biological kids, and our 2 youngest we adopted from Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake. And this is my beautiful suspension bridge that connected little bitty Covington to beautiful Cincinnati. So this is where I typically tell the rest of the story. Chip, in 2017, became suicidal. In July of 2017, the 4th was on a Tuesday, and like most holidays, we had a family get together. My brother hosted it on Sunday, and Chip had too much to drink that night. And when we went home, he said, "Joe, I'm going to sleep on the couch," which was nothing new by this point in our marriage. And I just shrugged it off and went to bed. The next morning, I had to work. I was a physical therapist, and I was the only therapist scheduled to work that day because it was a holiday weekend. And we were short-staffed, and I was the only PT in. So when I got up that morning, Chip was nowhere to be found. And I got angry because he should have never been behind the wheel of a car. Went to work angry, and as soon as I got there, the phone rang, and it was Chip. And Chip said, "Joe, it's okay. Don't panic. I'm all right. I was suicidal last night, and I had taken myself to the 15th Street train trestle, which was 10 blocks from our house, 12 blocks from our house, and he was going to hang himself. And for whatever reason, while he was on that train trestle, he had a moment of clarity. And he realized he didn't want to do that. He didn't want his ducks, which were his men that he had trained, to find him. So he fell down the train trestle, abraded his whole body, got back in his vehicle, and drove himself to the University of Cincinnati's emergency room. He admitted himself with suicidal ideation, and that's where he was calling from. I told him I would leave, I would come get him, and he said, "You can't. No one's allowed in, and I'm not allowed out." And that's where they put him on a 72-hour hold. So from there, he proceeded to tell me, "Do not call anyone. Don't tell anyone. I will be back in touch and let you know where they're going to take me." So, God forbid we share that we have suicidal thoughts or a mental illness. We're way too proud for that. So I kept it to myself and only shared it with a few very close people that I needed to share it with. The next day, he was transferred to an inpatient facility, and I was permitted to meet him there for his first psych evaluation at the facility. When I walked in the door, I saw my 6'2", handsome, lean husband, completely broken. And I will tell you, I have never stared at eyes that were so empty and so broken as his were that day. I told him I loved him, and I said, "We got this, right?" With that, we went and had our first meeting with our psychiatrist. And we sat in that room, and the psychiatrist said, "You are very lucky. You have a guardian angel. Men your age are rarely capable of stopping themselves when they get this far." And he said, "We're going to take good care of you." Chip proceeded to tell him, "Look, Doc, I am a career firefighter. I've been reading a lot, and I believe I have PTSD." And I was shocked. What in the world? That's for veterans, right? You know, that's our military. Where did you get this from? And Doc said, once again, "I got your back, and we're going to take care of you." So Chip was placed in something called an IOP. An IOP is an intense outpatient program. He would work on the west side of Cincinnati from 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning until about 4 p.m. And then he would cross town to get to the east side, where he would sit from 6 p.m. till 9 p.m., Monday through Thursday, for his IOP, group classes. I attended several of those classes with him. And again, I heard him tell multiple clinicians, "I believe I'm dealing with PTSD." But the thing I saw in those classes was my husband again. They prescribed they prescribed psych meds, an antidepressant, as well as they told him to quit drinking, and he quit cold turkey. Anyone that knew Chip knows that when he set his mind to do something, he did it with 110%. So the man no longer drank, and he was happy, and he was engaged, and he was back in our lives as a dad and a husband. On September 6th of 2017, we celebrated our 31st wedding anniversary. On September 9th, he graduated from his IOP. And on September 15th, he had purchased a gun on a credit card that I never used, walked our beautiful flood wall, and completed suicide right down in the flood wall in Covington. And at that point, I lost him. So I guess my question is, how does that happen? How does that happen in a metropolitan area with excellent health care? How do people miss that diagnosis when it's hand delivered. What I also tell people is this: suicide may relieve the individual of their pain, but all it does for the rest of us is disperse it and share it with a community and a family. I'm going to take a second and read to you a portion of Chip's suicide note. It says this: "This is no one's fault. No one should feel guilt or ask, what could I have done? I am not stressed with work. I am not stressed by family issues. I am not a weak, pathetic coward. I am mentally ill, and I scare myself to the point that I can no longer deal with what goes on inside my head." I could go on, but that would only confound the issue. The final story is, I have lived a good life in spite of myself. I have brought into this world and have helped raise wonderful children and a grandchild. All of them will go on to great things, but I can't take the chance of allowing my worsening mental issues to ruin that. So when you find me, know that it wasn't depression that pushed me over the edge, and I didn't relapse into alcohol addiction. That isn't what brought me to this point. Like people who suffer from cancer and other life-threatening diseases, some people suffer from equally debilitating mental illness, which in the end is equally terminal. God bless you all, and God save my soul. That is the story of a man who is completely broken and hopeless. It should never happen. We have to do better than this as a community, as a city, as a municipality, as a fire department, as a state, as a nation. These first responders are giving us so much more than we're aware of. And they're leaving people broken, and alone. So, after I lost him, I realized I needed to understand this. And when I found out the physiology and the sheer number of first responders leaving us by suicide, I realized we had to do more. So I started investigating what was available in our area. And right there in Cincinnati, we have something called the UC Stress Center. It was available and open at the time of Chip's death. You would think in this community that the UCER and the UC Psych and the UC Stress Center would be connected, but unfortunately for Chip, they were not. The IFF Center of Excellence was open and treating first responders like Chip. So I realized very quickly that if I didn't know all of this, there were probably others that didn't know it as well. So on the anniversary of his death, we formed a nonprofit in order to do a seminar. So we did our first seminar actually on the anniversary of his death. And we brought in speakers from across the country, and we taught about PTSD and how present it is in our first responder world. But we also started to offer resources. After I was done with that, I thought, I'm finished. I did my duty. Within 3 months of that seminar, I had my first phone call from a spouse who said, my husband is at the same facility Chip was at. What do I do? So I advised her that if it were me, I would take him to the IFF Center of Excellence, and he refused to go. I turned around and I said, ask him if he'll go if I fly with him. And he said yes. So pretty soon I find myself escorting first responders to inpatient facilities. To date, I've had 5 first responders reach out with guns in their hands. This slide is an old slide. We are over 20 first responders that we have assisted with inpatient care. We are at 60 first responders now that we have connected with local clinicians. So when I talk in other areas of the state and when I go to different areas in the country, the first thing I try to do is help the departments put together their peer support or resource list. And I'm happy to say that we've impacted lives. I know there are those there that are here because CHIPS enabled us to reach out to them and help them access appropriate care. So that's my story. It's not a happy one, but hopefully we're making a difference in this generation of first responders. Thank you.
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
I keep that excited. Thank you for being willing to share your story of pain and the growth that you've come to through the process. And we're very grateful, most importantly, for the time that you've given us this evening. So I'm going to stop the Facebook recording.